Hi everyone. This week I'm going to talk to you about art maths. So for some of you that might already be quite a daunting title. Many of you probably don't expect to come to fine art and think about anything mathematical at all, but I'm going to use that title for the purpose of us thinking about how we synthesize and indeed deconstruct ideas for and from visual outcomes. And in our case today, we're going to be continuing the work that I know Mrs. Perry started with you, that looks very much at Cubism, to an extent Primitivism, and also the contemporary American sculptor and artist Kimmy Cantrell. Maybe the term Primitivism for some of you will be a new term, and it's a term that's used to describe fascination that was kind of prevalent amongst a lot of early modern European artists. Um, it includes a kind of dialogue with tribal art from Africa, the South Pacific, Indonesia, but also it refers to very early European art, European folk art especially, and also just generally prehistoric art. The images you can see on the screen now are from a wide variety of very famous and well-regarded artists. You have Gauguin, Brancusi, Picasso, Rousseau, and Matisse. And I wonder if you could tell me or think about what all these well-known pieces of art actually have in common. Especially because when we look at them, we perhaps don't see a commonality amongst them, but actually um, they were all classed in some way under this umbrella term of primitivism. It leads me to this big question, and I really want you to think about this. How do we feel about the diverse cultures across many different nations, across many different times in history, being labelled as one homogenized group? What could we think about attitudes to Indigenous arts and crafts and cultures based on the collective description of primitive? Now, as we know, language is a very loaded thing, and when we use it, depending on who is speaking it and who is listening to it, there may be different interpretations of what language actually means, let alone what the language is in and of itself, for example, if it's English or if it's French. But really, that word primitivism, I think for a lot of us, has an element of negativity to it. Something that is primitive is very basic. And especially in our culture, things are considered to be basic are also possibly considered to have an extension into things that are considered maybe dull or simple in a way that is actually about stupidity. I want you to really dig deep about this. You're not going to be wrong if you are forming an opinion and you're responding to this kind of question with something that you really think. You may not have thought about any of this kind of thing before, and that is okay. But we do want you to consider how terms we use, maybe every day or even in more specialist ways, for example, in our subject areas, actually already have some kind of risk involved in them. There is a risk involved in using the word primitivism, and actually in more kind of contemporary practice, lots of people have actually moved away from using that term primitive or primitivism to describe the work, especially of Cubists. So Cubism, of course, you will know, the lead artist, along with Georges Braque, was of course Pablo Picasso. And I have an image, self-portrait he painted about 1906 on the screen now, just below me, but also an extraordinarily famous and important painting, which is an African-influenced painting. Picasso, by the way, was hugely influenced in his own Spanish culture by ancient Iberian art, especially Iberian sculpture. And more than that, when he moved to Paris, he spent a lot of time in a museum looking at tribal artifacts that had been collected, gathered and collected and brought to Paris for people to view. And so he would have seen things like tribal masks. He would have been aware of the way that in some tribal cultures, Ivory Coast especially, I think, there is a flattening out, even in a three-dimensional form, of what we could otherwise consider to be almost like a perspective plane. Anyway, this painting we can see of the 5 gathered females is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It's considered like the seminal painting that moved really modern art forward into this kind of new paradigm, the new culture of painting at the start of the 20th century. But actually, if we look very particularly at the 2 figures on the right of the painting, we're looking at mask-like faces. We're also looking at a painting in which the perspective plane again is flattened out, and a lot of Cubism does that. The actual subjects, it was a painting of 5 women, I think they were prostitutes working in a brothel that Picasso gathered. When we think about the term primitivism, and then we look at a painting such as this, again, there's a lot of loaded subtext to what these words mean and these words in connection with this painting. To put masks on the faces of women, I wonder about. To describe the way that the women are painted as being part of a primitivism is also loaded. And I do wonder about Picasso, much as as most art students and art enthusiasts love Picasso's work. We understand its value, we see its significance and its importance in the wider context of art history. I do wonder a lot about Picasso's feelings or indeed awareness of a word such as primitive to describe actually his own painting style. Did he endorse a sense that all cultures other than that of his own were something to be cherry-picked from? And again, we may find this in lots of examples of how we navigate myriad cultures in the giant melting pot that we perhaps all hope we're part of, where cultures that are extremely diverse can come together and not just coexist, but even perhaps meld and melt together so that there is no sense of separation or separateness between me and you, or he and she, or that person from that country and this person from this other country over here. I do wonder if there's something incredibly negative or extremely positive in the word primitive. And of course, we could extend that even into Cubism. When we label things, do we limit them? Again, for those of you who are really interested in this way of thinking and in thinking about art in this kind of context, I do want you always to consider that when you speak or write, or indeed even think about visual arts, that you really go into and pay attention to the language you use. And of course, the big question, where do we ever think art actually comes from? We're very lucky in this country. We can go to many free museums and art galleries. We can see the finest, so-called finest artwork ever in the world in some of our especially big London galleries. And when we stand before a painting or a piece of sculpture, or when we enter a room in which there's an installation, I wonder if we're able to really think about where the thing actually comes from. I don't mean just who the artist is who has made this one particular thing, but where all the experience and history is that underpins the idea that brings forth that particular piece into the world. So on the screen now, there is a sculpture. It is by an artist called Kimmy Cantrell, who I think you have been introduced to already by Mrs. Perry. And he's a very interesting study for us. He's alive now, he's working now, he lives in Georgia, I think, or he's from Georgia. I would love for you to go and have a look at his website. There's lots of things on the website, even though the kind of biographical detail is quite brief, where we've got lots of quotes and things that give us a bit of context about Kimmy Cantrell and how he sees his own artwork. I've put there on the screen a quote that says, "I want to show the beauty within flaws, Imperfections tell stories that are far more compelling than perfection. And of course, then when we look at his work, we can see what we may consider to be quite cubist type sculpture. We may understand it through looking at a human face and flattening out its forms. We might arrive at something that physically appears like this, but we could also say that Kimmy Cantrell highly likely knows about and understands the context, the wider context of Cubism, and also probably of Primitivism. I would also like you to pay attention here to the names of some of the pieces. And again, if you go onto his website, you'll see all kinds of thumbnails of the masks that are for sale. But the two I've got on screen now is one is Ancestors and the other is Future Past. Now, those titles are not accidental. They've been given a lot of thought. When we think about, again, how we use language to describe things or indeed analyze things, or of course, just label things, we have to remember that not only as we receive that language do we form an opinion, create an interpretation, but likewise when the person who has named the thing gets to that moment of naming, they too are naming through the prism or seeing the name through the prism of their own experience and their own understanding. Again, that is maybe quite a complicated thing to consider. And lots of you probably don't even touch the sides of this kind of thinking. But for real stretch and challenge, for those of you watching now who want to explore and pay attention, proper attention to why art is the way it is, what art means, these kinds of concerns, I think, are of vital importance. Now, Primitivism had a profound effect on modern Western art. I've already mentioned Picasso, and I mentioned again the discovery of African tribal art in the museum in Paris was really important. It was important to influence his painting, but it was really a major factor in leading him towards Cubism. I've said already about his Spanish heritage and the sense that he would have known a lot about Iberian sculpture. That also is testament to Picasso being by nature extremely curious. I know that with my own heritage, and again, that's a very loaded word, there are many things that, as somebody who also is quite curious, I have busied myself knowing about or finding out about, to do with, for example, Celtic art or Nordic folk art. In the same way, Picasso was looking into his Spanish heritage and he was thinking about Iberian culture. He would be thinking about kind of Romanji languages. There were lots of things that would have influenced him. I don't think it's difficult looking on the screen now to make a relationship between a painting, another self-portrait painting by Picasso, which is on the right, and an ancient Iberian sculpture, which is the largest image on the left. That sense of weightedness, that feeling that in Picasso's work, as you will also know, and again, for me in all my videos, reading things like Picasso's Trousers, he wanted to paint things to look as heavy as possible. Now, not only was that a stylistic thing, but that was, I think, also because he had such an incredible interest actually in sculpture. And of course, when we think about sculpture, we think about something that is three-dimensional. And also when we think about what sculptures tend to be made of, those materials are extremely heavy. So even in painting, we have a crossover and a relationship between Iberian sculpture and the famous painting I was showing you a moment ago, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. There is a relationship between those things. I wonder, this comes back to my title of Art Maths, can we reverse engineer the art we see? Now, sometimes we can reverse engineer the things we see simply on site, and that means we use our own wealth of knowledge, experience, and memory to try and piece apart how something might have been arrived at. When we look at Kimmy Cantrell, we look at his work, there are lots of assumptions we could make about where his ideas may have come from. That doesn't at all mean that I think Kimmy Cantrell has ripped off Cubism or indeed the notions of Primitivism, but it does tell me that he's probably aware of those things because those things come forward into his work. And some of you who've been taught by me before or for a long time have maybe heard me talking about my art teacher when I was at school, pronouncing to me, to my disdain, Sandy, art doesn't ever exist in a vacuum. And I always found that an incredibly obtuse thing because I probably didn't really understand it until later. And I realize now that what he was saying to me was actually that everything comes from something. When we make something that seems completely original, nonetheless, even in that originality, there will still be the underpinnings of other things that we will be aware of. There is virtually nothing completely new in the world. And some people might find that terribly depressing, but actually, that's also extremely invigorating for an artist. When we take different elements from what we know and what we like, especially, the fact is that we can, again, this term cherry pick, we can use that in a positive way to synthesize the things we think are brilliant so that we don't just end up in a cycle of copying what has come before, but where we add something new as an element of change to something that has already existed. And so actually, I think that's what Kimmy Cantrell has been doing, is I think that Kimmy Cantrell, much as he had a 20-year hiatus where he didn't make any art at all, that even in the period of his life when he became a businessman very successfully, apparently, he would still have been kind of aware of and maybe learning about older art movements, as in still modern art movements, Cubism, and again, that title, Primitivism. And he was also very aware, I guess, of his own life, his roots. He mentions his grandmother on his website as somebody who taught him perseverance and resilience. Even those kind of abstract things, those ephemeral or nebulous things, can still feed it into how he has then gone forward and made artifacts, sculptures that have a kind of durability to them. And they also have a sense of weightedness. And of course, they also have a very direct visual link to the sculptural forms, or indeed even the painted forms, of Cubism and Primitivism. So when we consider how art is arrived at, do we really understand the equation of experience, event, and culture that brings us to it? So I want you to think that any outcome that would be in the box where the question mark is at the moment has probably got lots of ingredients or parts of an equation that are added together first to arrive at that thing. And when we think about Kimmy Cantrell, I wonder if you can think about what elements there are that lead him to make the work he does. And I've also put another question on the screen now, which is, can any assumption ever be fair? Now, I work a lot with assumption, where I have a sense that I can go to Wikipedia and I can do lots of online research about artists or in general history. But actually, through the triangulation of information, sometimes I also do just have to take a leap of faith and form opinion. Now, up to a point, opinion can also be assumption. Might I assume things about Kimmy Cantrell based on the art he makes? So in the box now, I have the outcome, which is Kimmy Cantrell's work. But then in the earlier equation, the things that I've added together, I have A Head of a Woman by Picasso, a sculpture, very, very famous. And then I have a quote by Cantrell that I think is relevant here. He says again, imperfections tell stories far more compelling than perfection. So very similar, it's a paraphrase of the earlier quote I shared with you. I've always loved primitive art, and I try to reflect that raw primitive style in my own interpretations. Some of my work is tribal, and some is more universal. We all have roots, and the roots tend to come out in the works we create. Now, one, that quote entirely supports what I'm saying throughout the course of this presentation. The other thing about it, which I think is beautiful and wonderful and pertinent to our lives now is that where Cantrell is using that word primitive is he's using it actually in a celebratory way. He's not using it in a way that might cast diminishment or make something seem smaller or inferior or simple in a way that is about being stupid or not as advanced culturally. He's actually using it in a celebratory way. And actually, I would go forward and I would say that if I were one of you and I had to write an analysis of Kimmy Cantrell's work, I would actually talk about a sense of joyousness in what he does. Now, you've got 2 tasks to complete, and you're going to be looking at these with Mrs. Perry over the course of the next couple of weeks until I meet with you again. I would like you to make a written response to the notion of primitivism. I would like you to state what your opinions are of the name, that word. We've already talked about loaded language. The name, the context, and the value. You should consider the link between primitivism and Cubism, like where does Cubism come from in terms of primitivism, explaining why they are interconnected and by whom. I've given you some big names there. And by the way, Cubism comes into primitivism and primitivism kind of comes into Cubism. So there's a lot of overlap. And then the second task is to create an analysis page on the work of Kimmy Cantrell, clearly linking his work to Cubism, but of course also to primitivism. Stretch and challenge in this is to make connections to the wider world context. So to do this well, you're probably going to have to go visit Kimmy Cantrell's website, have a look across many examples of his work. As I said, on his website, there are lots of thumbnails of his sculptures that are for sale or that are in galleries. I wouldn't spend too much time trying to find lots of written evidence about what Cantrell does, because actually there isn't that much. But what I would do is I would go and I would read about Cubism and primitivism. I would go and find out about Picasso and Iberian sculpture and how that is a thing in terms of understanding more deeply where Cubism comes from, because of course Cubism really informs what Cantrell is doing. So you're going to do this work. It's written as a base in your sketchbooks. Of course, you're going to have to include visual examples to refer to. And I think for those of you who want to meet this task with a sense of excellence, don't forget that you can assume things and that you should, of course, always feel confident to express your opinion if your opinion can be justified. So that just remains for me to say that I wish you the best of luck, and I really look forward to reading and seeing what you produce.